The olive groves of the Keritis Valley run green and silver in the last week of May, 1941. The trees are old. Some of them were standing when the Turks still held this island, and their trunks have split and hollowed with age until a grown man can press himself inside one and disappear. Below them, a shallow river slides over white stones toward the coast of Chania, a little under 8 miles to the northeast. The Cretans call this low-ground Prison Valley, after the stone farm prison that squats at its center. On the morning of the 21st of May, that valley is held by roughly 850 young men in mismatched uniforms. Most of them are Cretan boys, recruits and gendarmes and military cadets, grouped under the name of the Eighth Greek Regiment. Between them, they have a few hundred serviceable rifles, a thin scattering of ammunition, and almost nothing heavier. The New Zealand Brigade they have been attached to expects very little of them. What those 850 men do over the following 7 days will help carry more than 16,000 British, Australian, and New Zealand soldiers off Crete alive. That is not the version most people heard. For decades, the loss of Crete was remembered in London as a British and Commonwealth affair. A costly defeat counted in shattered New Zealand battalions and sunken cruisers, with the Greeks and the islanders themselves reduced to a sentence about brave irregulars carrying old guns. The men who fought beside them knew the fuller truth. Their report said so. Their war diaries said so. If this story is already pulling you in, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who is listening. To understand why those 850 matter, you have to go back to what had just happened on the mainland. In the spring of 1941, the German army had driven the Allies out of Greece in a matter of weeks. British, Australian, and New Zealand units that had been sent north to help the Greeks were thrown back down the peninsula, and at the end of April, the Royal Navy lifted some 57,000 of them off the beaches under air attack. A great many of those men came to Crete. They arrived exhausted, beaten, and stripped of their equipment. Guns, trucks, radios, tents, most of it had been left behind in Greece or sunk in the harbors. They were soldiers in name, but many of them had nothing to fight with except the rifle in their hands, and some did not even have that. Crete sat across the eastern Mediterranean like a long stone breakwater, roughly 160 miles from end to end, and never more than about 30 miles across. A spine of high mountains divides the populated northern coast from the empty south. In 1941, only 3 usable roads crossed that spine. Everything else moved on goat tracks. The towns, the harbors, and the airfields all lay along the northern shore, at Maleme in the west, at Rethymno in the center, and at Heraklion in the east, with the naval anchorage of Suda Bay near Chania. Whoever held those airfields held the island, because an army that came by air would die on the ground unless it could capture a runway and fly in heavy weapons and reinforcement. Winston Churchill wanted the island held. He had strategic reasons, the harbors and the airfields, and the threat they posed to the Axis flank. And he had political reasons too, because after a year of retreats he badly needed a victory that the public could see. He believed Crete could be that victory. To command its defense, he chose a New Zealand general named Bernard Freyberg, a brave man, much decorated from the previous war, well liked by his soldiers, and an old personal friend. It was not a happy choice. Freyberg did not believe the island could be held. He told the Middle East commander, General Wavell, that there were not enough men on Crete to hold it, and that the whole commitment ought to be reconsidered. He took up the burden when it was given to him, but he never shook off that pessimism, and it shaped everything he did. The force he commanded was called Crete Force. On paper, it was large, something close to 40,000 Commonwealth troops together with around 10,000 Greek soldiers and a population of armed and furious civilians. In practice, it was a collection of fragments. Battalions had been shuffled together from the wreckage of the Greek campaign. Many men had no officers they knew. There were a handful of tanks, a scattering of artillery pieces, a great many of them captured Italian guns without proper sights, and so few radios that orders often had to travel on foot. The fighter aircraft on the island, a few worn-out Hurricanes and Gladiators, had been ground down by the Luftwaffe and pulled away before the battle began. When the Germans came, the skies over Crete would belong entirely to them. There is a bitter irony folded into the weakness of the Greek forces on the island, and it is worth pausing on. When the Italians had invaded Greece in the autumn of 1940, the British had put a garrison on Crete so that the Greek government could send the island's own division, the 5th Cretan Division, north to fight on the mainland. Those were Crete's trained soldiers, its own sons under arms, and they were away in the mountains of Albania and northern Greece when the German offensive broke the country in the spring. Many of them were killed or taken prisoner there. So when the airborne assault finally fell on their home island in May, the men best equipped to defend it were gone, scattered or dead far to the north. What remained on Crete were raw recruits, gendarmes, military cadets, garrison details, and the civilian population itself. The island had been stripped of its defenders to help hold the mainland, and now it would have to be held by whoever was left. The Germans came under the command of General Kurt Student, the chief architect of the German airborne arm. His plan carried the code name Operation Mercury, and it was something no army had ever attempted at this scale. The whole assault would be delivered from the air, by parachute and by glider, with mountain troops to follow once an airfield had been seized. These were not second-rate soldiers. The Fallschirmjäger, the German paratroopers, were among the most carefully selected and rigorously trained men in the German order of battle, and they had been built up in the propaganda of the Reich as something close to invincible. They expected to drop onto a demoralized garrison and gather up the island in a few days. Student divided his force into 3 groups for the assault, aimed at the west around Maleme and Chania, the center at Rethymno, and the east at Heraklion. The whole design rested on speed and on the belief that the defenders were few and broken. German intelligence had badly underestimated the size of Crete force, and it had written off the Greek units as worthless. The paratroopers were told, in effect, to expect a walkover. Many of them jumped believing the hardest part of the day would be the landing itself. They had badly misread the people waiting for them. The Germans assumed the Greek troops on Crete were a broken remnant, barely worth counting, and that the Cretan population would stay in their houses. Both assumptions were wrong, and the price of being wrong would be paid in the first hours of the battle. An airborne assault is a gamble taken in the open. The men who jump arrive scattered, lightly armed, and stripped to the trucks and guns and supply trains that a normal army carries with it. For a few hours after they land, they are at their most vulnerable, separated from the weapon containers dropped alongside them, unsure where the rest of their stick has come down, exposed in fields they have never seen. If the defender hits them hard in those first hours, before they can gather an arm and dig in, they can be wiped out. If the defender hesitates, they consolidate, and then they become very hard to shift. Everything on Crete turned on those first hours, and on whether the men holding the island would strike at once or wait. The soldiers, for the most part, struck. Too many of their commanders waited. There was one more factor, and it would tangle the record for 30 years afterward. British intelligence had broken into the German signals through the work at Bletchley Park, the secret the Allies called Ultra. Freiberg knew, in advance and in real detail, that an airborne assault was coming and roughly where it would fall. What he did not know precisely was the day, which slipped by a week when German supply problems in Greece delayed the launch, and the exact balance the Germans would strike between landings from the air and landings from the sea. Freiberg fixed a great deal of his attention on a seaborne invasion that the Royal Navy would in fact destroy at sea, and he held back from some of the aggressive counterattacks that the airborne threat demanded. The ultra-secret could not be revealed after the war for fear of betraying that the codes had been read. So for a generation, the historians who tried to explain why Crete was lost were working with half the picture deliberately hidden from them, and the questions of who had failed and who had saved the day were argued in a fog that only began to lift in the 1970s. The assault opened on the morning of the 20th of May. It began, as these things did, with the aircraft. Messerschmitts and Stukas came in low over the northern coast, strafing the anti-aircraft pits and the gun positions, the sirens of the dive bombers screaming as they fell. Behind them came the bombers, and behind those, filling the sky, the slow, ungainly transports and the gliders. Each Junkers transport carried about 17 men. Each glider carried 9, or an equivalent weight in heavy equipment, the light guns and mortars and flamethrowers and motorcycles that paratroopers could not jump with. They came down across Maleme, around Chania and Suda, and that afternoon over Rethymno and Heraklion as well. The gliders came in last, and almost without sound, the roar of the transports fading as the tow ropes were cut, the long-winged machines sinking toward the fields and the dry riverbeds with their loads of guns and assault troops. A glider could set 9 armed men onto a precise patch of ground, or a single heavy weapon, exactly where parachutes could not. They crash-landed among the rocks and the olive trees, and the men inside, if they survived the impact, came out fighting. What the German planners had not reckoned with was the killing that began before their men reached the ground. The transports flew straight and low to drop their sticks, and the gunners below fired into them as they came. One Royal Marine sergeant who watched it remembered the transports breaking apart in the air and men spilling out of them like sacks. Paratroopers hung helpless under their canopies as rifle and machine gun fire reached up for them. A New Zealand officer described a German landing almost on top of his position and the shooting that followed as something closer to a hunt than a battle. Whole sticks of paratroopers were cut down before they could free themselves from their parachutes and reach the weapons canisters dropped separately alongside them. The casualties among the German officers, the men who were supposed to gather the scattered groups and turn them into a fighting force, were especially heavy, and that loss of leadership crippled the assault in its first hours. The plan for Maleme had been a pincer, with paratroopers dropping onto the airfield and onto the ground at both sides of it, a dispersal that only made sense if the defenders were as thin as the Germans imagined. They were not. The drop zones to the east and the center came down on top of New Zealand positions, and the men who landed there were cut down before they could organize. Only the western group, which fell beyond the Tavernitis where no one had been posted, came through intact, and even they now faced the task of fighting across the riverbed to reach the airfield. General Meindl, commanding the western assault, was badly wounded in the first hours. The same thing was happening everywhere. The officers meant to gather the scattered sticks and weld them into a force were falling, and without them the famous discipline of the airborne arm came apart into knots of men fighting and dying on their own. At Rethymno, the Australians fought a clear-headed, aggressive defense and had broken the back of the threat to their airfield by the end of the second day. At Heraklion, the combined Australian and British defense was so complete that on the 22nd of May the garrison buried no fewer than 1,300 German dead. These were the elite of Students' airborne arm, and they were being destroyed piecemeal across the northern coast. For the German command, watching from Greece, the reports coming back were a nightmare. Whole units had simply vanished from the radio net. Sets lay smashed in the fields with their operators dead beside them. The careful timetable of the operation had collapsed within hours. Across the island, the elite of the airborne arm was being killed faster than anyone in Berlin had thought possible, and the men who lived were scattered, leaderless, and pinned in place. On the evening of that first day, by any honest reading of the situation, the invasion of Crete was failing. And here, in the towns and the villages, something happened that the German command had not planned for at all. The Cretan people went to war. Crete had a long and bloody tradition of resistance, generations of it, against the Turks who had ruled the island within living memory, and the men and women of the villages did not wait to be told what to do. Paratroopers who landed in the streets and the fields found themselves set upon by whoever was at hand. One witness described isolated Germans being attacked by the entire population of a district, men, women, and children, with whatever could be turned into a weapon. Some of the islanders carried flintlock rifles taken from the Turks 100 years before. Others came with axes, with scythes, with spades, with kitchen knives. This was the first time in the war that a German invading force met armed civilian resistance on this scale, and it shook them. It also marked the people of Crete for a reckoning that would come later, in the form of mass executions, once the island had fallen. The fighting spirit of the islanders was not a sudden or surprising thing to anyone who knew Crete. The island had risen against its rulers again and again over the centuries, against the Venetians, and then against the Ottoman Turks, and almost every household kept the memory of it, and often an old gun to go with the memory. When the paratroopers came down among the vines and the orchards, the response was immediate and without mercy. Old men who had fought the Turks took down rifles that belonged in a museum. Women carried ammunition forward and, in places, took up weapons themselves. Boys ran messages between positions under fire. The Germans, who had expected a frightened and passive population, found instead that every village was hostile ground, and that a paratrooper separated from his unit was a man in mortal danger. Nothing in their experience of the war so far had prepared them for it, and it filled them with a cold fury that the villages would answer for once the fighting stopped. The clearest single example came at Kastelli, a small port out on the far western edge of the island. A detachment of about 74 paratroopers under a Lieutenant Merb was dropped near the town to seize the harbor. Waiting for them was the 1st Greek Regiment, around 1,000 men, with only about 600 rifles between them, 3 rounds for each rifle, and 2 worn-out machine guns. By any reasonable accounting, they should have been brushed aside. Instead, supported by the local police and the townspeople, they fought with discipline and ferocity. 3 hours after the Germans landed, the detachment had been wiped out. Merb and more than 50 of his men were dead. The 17 who survived owed their lives to the floor of the town jail, where the Greeks had locked them away for safekeeping. A handful of poorly armed Greek soldiers and the people of one small town had destroyed a unit of the most feared airborne force in the world. It was a small action on the edge of a large battle, and it has often been left out of the histories altogether. But it told the whole story in miniature. Given even a little time and a position they could defend, the Greek soldiers and the Cretan people could and did destroy the best troops Germany could put against them. The defenders of Crete could fight, and at Kastelli they proved it past any argument. The disaster, when it came, fell on the one place where the men on the ground were not allowed to fight as they could have, and that place was the airfield at Maleme. In Prison Valley, a few miles southwest of Chania, the resistance was just as stubborn and more consequential. The rump of the German 3rd Parachute Regiment had come down there, and it could make no headway. There is one small episode from those days that catches the whole character of the fighting. A British liaison officer, Captain Michael Forrester, arrived in the valley as a German push was building, and he gathered up a crowd of Greek soldiers and armed villagers and led them straight at the enemy. He wore shorts and a yellow jersey, carried a revolver, and had no helmet on his head. Behind him came a ragged, shouting mass of men, one of them with a serrated bread knife lashed to a shotgun in place of a bayonet. They went over the rise and straight into the German line, and they broke up the attack. It was not how a set-piece battle was supposed to be fought. It worked. The 8th Greek Regiment had been handed to the New Zealand Brigade commander, Howard Kippenberger, who placed it out on his western flank around the village of Alikianos at the mouth of Prison Valley. He did not expect much of it. Almost no one did. The regiment was under strength, its men barely trained, its rifles too few to go around, and its ammunition counted out in single rounds. On paper, it was the weakest link in the whole Western defense, the unit a commander posts somewhere quiet, and prays he will never have to lean on. The Germans dropped their 3rd Parachute Regiment and an engineer battalion almost directly onto it. Closer to the prison itself, the 8th Greek Regiment was dug into the olive groves and the riverbed. On that first day, the Germans sent an engineer battalion against them, and the Greeks did not break. They held their ground and threw the attack back. This was the unit the Allied officers had written off, the boys with too few rifles and too little ammunition. And on the opening day of the largest airborne assault in history, they had decisively repulsed a German battalion. The ground helped them. The olive groves broke up the German formations, and the riverbed gave cover, and the boys of the regiment knew the lie of every wall and ditch in the valley, because it was their own country. By the end of that first day, the contempt the Germans had carried with them across the water had been answered in full. The Greek regulars had not run. The Cretan villagers had not stayed behind their doors. The Commonwealth infantry had cut the airborne assault to ribbons in the air and on the ground. The men the propaganda had dismissed were winning the battle, and they knew they were winning it. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is far more in the record still to cover, and your support is what keeps these stories coming. By nightfall on the 20th of May, Kurt Student was staring at catastrophe. His paratroopers had been slaughtered in the air and on the ground. His officers were dead in heaps. Across the whole island, he had only 2 intact bodies of troops still under proper command, the 2 battalions of his assault regiment west of Maleme airfield, and the battered survivors of the 3rd Regiment pinned in Prison Valley. The garrison the German propaganda had dismissed was on the edge of annihilating the invasion. Several times in those first hours the Germans came within a hair of total defeat. What turned the battle was a failure of nerve and judgment on the Allied side, and it happened at one place, Maleme. Maleme Airfield was the center of gravity of the entire campaign. It was the one place the Germans had to take, because only there could they fly in the mountain troops and the heavy weapons that would let them win. The airfield was held by a single company of New Zealand infantry, about 140 men in slit trenches around the perimeter, with the rest of their battalion nearby, and the dominating high ground of Hill 107 just to the south. The valley of the Tavernitis to the west, and the bridge across it, had been left undefended, which gave the surviving German assault troops a sheltered place to gather. Through the first day and into the night, the New Zealanders on and around the airfield fought hard, under constant air attack, short of water and ammunition, taking losses, and they held. What lost Maleme was the silence behind the men holding it. The Germans to their front had not broken them. The battalion commander on Hill 107, running low on everything and unable to raise help, sent up his distress flares. The two neighboring New Zealand battalions, under orders to support him and under almost no pressure themselves, did nothing. They stayed wired into their own positions. Their brigade commander remained at his headquarters miles to the rear and never came forward to see the ground. Up the chain, the same paralysis repeated itself. Senior officers who had learned their trade in the static trench warfare of the previous war could not bring themselves to order the swift, violent counterattack that the moment demanded, and the men at the top, Freiberg among them, did not visit the front line to grasp how close to winning they were. Late in the night, exhausted and convinced he was about to be overrun, the commander on Hill 107 pulled his men back several hundred yards, giving up the high ground that dominated the airfield. He did it on his own judgment, abandoned by the brigade behind him. By the time anyone organized a proper counterattack, it was too weak and it came too late. The next morning the Germans, who had themselves been on the point of giving up, found the high ground open and the airfield within their grasp. They flew in the mountain troops. The transports came down one after another on the disputed strip, some of them crashing and burning as they landed, the mountain infantry running out under fire, and the trickle became a flood. The single greatest opportunity of the battle had been thrown away by the men who would not let the soldiers fight, rather than by the soldiers themselves. Even after Maleme, the killing of Germans went on. On the second day, a fresh German attack near the airfield was destroyed in minutes by New Zealand rifles and Bren guns, leaving around 200 paratroopers dead in front of the positions. At sea, the Royal Navy, under Admiral Cunningham, found and smashed one German seaborne flotilla in the dark and scattered another the next day, so that not one German soldier reached Crete by sea while the battle for the airfields was being decided. But the Navy paid a terrible price for it. With no air cover and German dive bombers ranging over the narrow waters, the fleet was torn apart. 3 cruisers and 6 destroyers were sunk. A carrier, 3 battleships, half a dozen cruisers, and more destroyers were damaged. Close to 2,000 sailors were killed. Within a few days, Cunningham had almost nothing left fit to fight, and he admitted plainly that in those coastal waters, against unchallenged enemy aircraft, the Navy had been beaten. He went on lifting soldiers off the island anyway, because the alternative was to abandon them. The cost of keeping the sea closed to the Germans is hard to overstate. Sailors fought their ships through days of unbroken air attack with no fighters overhead to shield them, watching the bombs walk across the water toward them, and knowing there was little they could do. Vessels went down with most of their crews still aboard. The men who survived were often pulled from the sea oil-soaked and burned. The Navy could have stood off and saved its ships, and Cunningham knew the losses were close to ruinous. But to stand off would have meant leaving the soldiers on Crete to be killed or taken prisoner, and the Navy would not do that. It stayed, and it bled, and it kept lifting men off the beaches until there were no nights left to do it in. Once Maleme was theirs and the mountain regiments were ashore, the Germans began to push east along the coast, grinding forward behind air attack and artillery and the steady pressure of fresh troops. The Allied line bent back through Galatas, the little hilltop village west of Chania, where on the 25th of May the New Zealanders fought one of their fiercest actions of the entire war, a desperate, screaming counterattack that retook the village for a time and is remembered to this day in the square below its white church. It could not change the outcome. There were too many Germans now, and they owned the sky. Galatas became the emblem of that fighting retreat. When the Germans took the village on the 25th of May, 2 understrength New Zealand companies, with a pair of light tanks, were sent back in to retake it. They went up the road into the dusk shouting as they came, into streets swept by machine gun fire, and for a few hours they drove the Germans out and held the place. They could not stay. There were too few of them, and far too many of the enemy. But the sheer ferocity of that charge is remembered as one of the finest things the New Zealand Division did in the whole war, and the village has never let the memory of it go. On the 27th of May, the decision was taken to abandon Crete. The men would be marched south, over the mountains, to be lifted off the beaches on the far coast by the Navy. Churchill, who had staked so much on the island, would not let go even then. On that same day, he signaled the Middle East Command that victory on Crete was essential at this turning point of the war, and that they should keep throwing in everything they had. By that point, the local commanders were already writing the orders for withdrawal. The signal changed nothing on the ground. The army was leaving. Withdrawal is the most dangerous thing an army can attempt. An army that turns its back on a pursuing enemy and funnels itself down a single mountain road can be cut to pieces if the enemy gets among it. The only road south from the Chania front climbed up into the White Mountains and then dropped down a gorge to a tiny fishing village on the southern coast called Sphakia, in Greek or Sphakian. Tens of thousands of men, many of them without weapons or order, had to move along that one route by night, with the Stukas hunting the column by day. For the evacuation to work, somebody had to hold the door open behind them. Somebody had to stand and fight a rearguard while the rest got away. A great deal of that rearguard fighting fell to the Australians and New Zealanders. At a sunken lane near Chania that the soldiers had nicknamed 42nd Street, after the field company of engineers dug in along it, several understrength Australian and New Zealand battalions turned on their pursuers on the 27th of May and met them with a bayonet charge that left an estimated 280 Germans dead and stopped the advance cold for the rest of the day. In the gorge above Sphakia, a New Zealand officer named Charles Upham performed the actions that earned him the first of the 2 Victoria Crosses he would win in the war, fighting in the ravines that flanked the road as the mountain troops tried to outflank the column. The commandos of Lay Force, under Robert Laycock, were thrown in as a final rearguard, ordered to hold until the fighting troops were away, a role that all but guaranteed most of them would be left behind. And behind the western half of that whole retreating army, back in Prison Valley, the 8th Greek Regiment was still fighting. They had held since the first day. Day after day, they stood off the German Engineer Battalion, and then the men of the German 85th and 100th Mountain Regiments, in the olive groves and along the bed of the Keritis, 850 lightly armed boys against the weight of regular German infantry with air support overhead. They held the southwestern edge of the valley, the very ground the Germans needed to swing wide and get behind the New Zealand Division and cut the road south. For 7 days they would not give it up. The historians who studied the battle most closely, Anthony Beaver and Alan Clark among them, credit that stand with making the evacuation of Western Crete possible. Beaver's reckoning is that the defense of Alikianos bought at least a further 24 hours for the last stage of the withdrawal, the hours behind which Lay Force and the rearguard pulled the army out. Without the stubbornness of the Cretan irregulars and the 8th Greek Regiment in the south of Prison Valley, it is likely the New Zealand Division would have been encircled and forced to surrender where it stood. The men who were saved had begun the battle with more and better weapons than the Greeks who saved them. What the 8th Greek Regiment did in those days has to be measured against what it was. These were not hardened soldiers. They were boys with a few rounds apiece, holding a line that regular German infantry, supported from the air and stiffened by mountain troops, struck again and again. They had no realistic hope of relief and every reason to break and run. They did neither. They fought from the olive groves and the bed of the Keritis and the walls of the prison farm, gave ground slowly when they had to, and made the Germans by the valley a yard at a time. Every day they held was a day the German right could not swing south and shut the trap behind a retreating Commonwealth division. The German commanders, who had expected to sweep the valley aside in an afternoon, found themselves stalled there for a week by troops they had not thought worth counting. The road over the mountains was a column of beaten men. Soldiers staggered south for days with little food and no shelter, harried from the air, dropping their gear by the roadside. The march to the south coast was an ordeal in itself. The one road climbed steeply into the White Mountains and then fell away down a long gorge toward the sea, and along it moved a river of men, some still in their units and under arms, a great many of them stragglers who had lost everything. The dive bombers worked the column in daylight, so most of the movement happened at night. Men stumbling in the dark over broken ground, parched and starving, leaving behind packs and weapons they no longer had the strength to carry. Cretan villagers along the route, who had every reason to think only of their own danger, came out with bread and water and shelter for the soldiers as they passed, and they would go on hiding and feeding stranded Allied men for months and years afterward, knowing they could be shot for it. At Sphakia, the Navy came in by night and took them off the open beach, a few thousand at a time, ships crowding in under the threat of the dawn and the dive bombers that came with it. Over 4 nights, the Royal Navy lifted roughly 16,000 men off the southern coast. Another group was taken out of Heraklion in the east by sea, only to be caught by the Luftwaffe on the voyage back and savaged, with heavy loss of life and ships. There was never enough room or enough time. The men who reached the beach last, or who had lost their units in the mountains, gathered in the dark and waited for ships that could not carry them all. One New Zealand brigade commander, Howard Kippenberger, who had placed the 8th Greek Regiment in Prison Valley at the start of the battle, wrote afterward of the misery of those last hours, of marching his men down to the beach past crowds of stragglers who begged for a place, of the shame he felt walking away from them, of the cordon at the water's edge with orders to shoot any man who tried to rush the boats. He counted his men through, and they were among the last aboard. On the night of the 31st of May, the senior officer still ashore, General Weston, gave the order to surrender what remained. On the 1st of June, the last organized resistance ended. Around 5,000 Allied soldiers were left behind to be taken prisoner, and with them thousands of Greek troops and the wounded who could not be moved. The island belonged to Germany. It had cost the Germans more than they could bear. By the count later set down, the British and Commonwealth forces lost about 4,000 dead, 2,000 wounded, and more than 11,000 taken prisoner. The Germans suffered something on the order of 7,000 casualties, with roughly 4,000 of those dead or missing, and the worst of it fell on the airborne arm that Student had built and believed in. The Fallschirmjäger had been gutted. Student himself called Crete the graveyard of the German paratroopers. Adolf Hitler drew the lesson that great airborne assaults cost too much, and he ordered that there would be no more of them on this scale. The most feared parachute force in the world had won an island, and, in doing so, had destroyed itself as an instrument of attack. It never jumped en masse in a battle again. The Cretans paid in a different currency. Furious at the resistance of the civilian population and at the losses inflicted on his men, Student ordered reprisals across the island, collective punishment of the villages that had fought. The killing began even before the battle was fully over and went on into the summer and beyond. Around Alikianos, the very ground the 8th Greek Regiment had held, German paratroopers carried out a series of executions. On the 2nd of June, in the churchyard of the village, men were marched out and shot in groups of 10 in front of their own families. 42 were killed there in a single operation. Across Alikianos and the nearby villages, the number of civilians shot in the reprisals rose past 200, men aged from 14 to 80. The Germans were unsettled. Witnesses recalled that the women did not turn their faces away. They stood and watched their husbands and sons die. At other villages, at Kandamari and at Kindanos and elsewhere, the pattern was repeated, whole communities destroyed and their men killed to punish the island for having fought. So where, in all this, is the buried report? The honest answer is more complicated than a single locked file, and it is worth telling plainly, because the truth does the Greeks and the Cretans more justice than any legend could. There was no secret document that named the Greeks as the saviors of the British Army and was then hidden in a vault. What there was, instead, was a defeat that nobody in London wanted to examine too closely, and a contribution that was quietly recorded and then allowed to fade. Crete had been meant as Churchill's victory. It became, in the words of his angriest critics in the Australian government, his second Dardanelles, an echo of the disaster he had helped author in the previous war. When it was over, the War Office in London held a series of inquiries into how the operation had failed. The New Zealand government pressed for assurance that the right man had been in command. The Australian government, which had seen its soldiers fight well and then be left behind to surrender, reminded the British bluntly of the shortcomings of the whole Greek and Cretan adventure, and Churchill was sharply irritated by the criticism. A defeat under that kind of political pressure is not a story a government tells loudly, and it is not one in which it goes out of its way to share the credit with foreign troops and foreign civilians. On top of that lay the ultra-secret. The single most important fact about how Crete was fought, that the British had read the German plans in advance, could not be admitted for 30 years. That silence protected a code. It also distorted the entire post-war account of the battle. The questions of why the airfields were lost, and who had judged rightly and who had not. With the central thread of the story deliberately cut, the published histories leaned on the parts that could be told, the command failures, the Navy's ordeal, the stands of the Commonwealth battalions. The Greek regiments and the Cretan villagers, who had no staff officers writing memoirs in English and no government in London arguing their case, slipped to the margins of the page. The record of what they did was never actually destroyed. It survived in the unit war diaries, in the official histories written years later, in the memoirs of the men who had been there. The New Zealand official history set down the role of the Eighth Greek Regiment and the Cretan irregulars. Kippenberger, who had commanded the brigade they fought under, wrote honestly about them. And when historians like Beaver and Clark went back to the sources with the ultra-secret finally in the open, they reached the conclusion the evidence had always supported, that the stand at Alikianos and the fury of the Cretan resistance had helped save the army that got away. The burial, such as it was a burial by neglect and by political discomfort and by official secrecy, not by a single hand sweeping a file out of sight. The result was the same. For most of a lifetime, the men who had held Prison Valley were a footnote in someone else's defeat. The recovery of their story was slow, and it came mostly from outside the official channels. Veterans went back to the island in later years and were embraced by the villages. Greek and Cretan families kept the memory alive in their own communities long before it ever reached an English-language history. And when the full account could finally be written, with the intelligence secret lifted and the archives opened, the verdict of the careful historians was plain, and it matched what the soldiers who had been there had always known. The Greeks and the Cretans had not been bystanders to the defense of their island. At more than one point in those days, they had been the difference between an army that escaped and an army that did not. Go to Crete today, and you can find the truth standing in stone. At Alikianos, a marble column and canopy marked the spot where the 850 boys of the 8th Greek Regiment held out for a week against the German onslaught, and a short distance away is the churchyard where their neighbors were shot in reprisal. At Kastelli, there is a memorial to the Greek soldiers and the townspeople who destroyed Lieutenant Merv's detachment in 3 hours of close fighting. At Galatas, every year, the New Zealanders who come back to the island are received by people who have not forgotten who stood beside them, and the village holds a service in the little square below the white church for the men who died there. The warmth that greets a New Zealander or an Australian anywhere on Crete has its source in those days in May and June of 1941, in the memory of an army that fought hard for the island and of the islanders who fought just as hard for it and for them. On Hill 107 above Maleme, the ground the New Zealanders gave up in the dark. There is now a German war cemetery, and the paratroopers who were meant to be invincible lie there in their thousands, in neat rows above the airfield they died to take. Down by the water at Suda Bay lies the Commonwealth Cemetery, with its lines of New Zealand and Australian and British dead. The two of them, the killers and the killed of that spring, look out over the same blue stretch of sea the Navy crossed and recrossed to carry the living away. The German paratroopers who jumped on Crete were among the finest soldiers their country fielded, and they were broken on this ground by men they had been taught to despise. 1,000 Greeks with 600 old rifles and 3 rounds apiece. A captain in shorts and a yellow jersey leading villagers with kitchen knives over a ridge. 850 boys in the olive groves of Prison Valley who would not let go of a riverbed, and who held the door open one more day, and then one more, while 16,000 other men walked over the mountains to the sea and lived. The defeat was real. The island was lost. But the part the Greeks and the Cretans played in saving the army that escaped was real too, and it was true the whole time, even in the years when almost no one said it out loud. The stone at Alikianos has been saying it all along, to anyone who stops to read it. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen carry the story forward. Subscribe if you have not already, and I will see you in the next one.